Happy Sunday, everyone. Hope you're all doing great. We are talking about the last dream, or actually possibly plural dreams, that Joseph Smith had prior to being martyred. I prefer the word murdered, before being killed. This, of course, in June of 1844. Now, the timeline is such that apparently the night before his martyrdom, Joseph had a dream. We'll talk about this one. Apparently, perhaps also the night before that, he had another dream. And then there's a similar one 4 months prior that he had as well. So those are the three dreams that we're going to talk about. As is commonly the case with Joseph, who didn't so much write down his own stuff, always relied on scribes or other people were recording what they heard Joseph say. These dreams are reported by other people with varying reliability and recency to when they recorded it. So we'll have some qualifiers as we dig into this. The first question I had as I was reading these dreams is, was Joseph a dreamer? Because I didn't really recall much about Joseph Jr. talking about dreams. Certainly visions, right? Directly seeing Jesus Christ and seeing Heavenly Father and having angelic visitors, minister and teach him. So certainly visions were a part of his experience, but what about dreams? I mean, Joseph Sr., his dad, was definitely a dreamer. He had a bunch of dreams. His wife Lucy recorded a handful of them. One of the more well-known ones is having a dream of the tree of life, similar to Lehi's experience, like a decade prior to when Joseph found the Book of Mormon. Of course, the skeptics will be, oh, well, that's why Joseph put in the Book of Mormon, because he heard his dad, talk about this or whatever. But Joseph Sr. was a dreamer. Joseph Jr., as I said, was more of at least my impression before digging in here, he was more of a visionary. It reminded me of Joel chapter 2, where it says, your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions. So I'm like, okay, the old man, Joseph Smith Sr., was dreaming dreams. Young man, Joseph Jr., was seeing visions. Joseph himself said in 1839 that an open vision will manifest that which is more important. So he definitely experienced, and he wanted others to experience open visions. But the dreams that we're going to get into, these last dreams that he had, were these par for the course, or were they, a few among many? Did they stand out in some way? So I dug into this a little bit to find what I could on, was Joseph Jr. a dreamer? Was he often having, or prior to these dreams towards the very end of his life, was he having and sharing and perhaps even giving the interpretation of dreams? So as I dug into a little bit, the answer is yes, there were other dreams. These ones that I'll share momentarily were not anomalous or exceptional. He was having other dreams and talking about them. All of the ones, however, that I could find were in the last years of his life, the 1842, 1844, which is interesting. Very plausible answer is that he was having and talking about dreams before then, but they just didn't survive in people's journals and records and letters and so forth. So it's still very possible. Or it could be that this was kind of the winding up of his life. He was feeling this anxiety to try and, get the temple built and teach the people and whatnot. And as a result, he's having more dreams. So in a letter to his wife, Emma, in August of 1842, he referred to the dream and vision that was manifested to me on the last night. So here he says the dream and vision, kind of interesting combination of terms. In his journal earlier that year in January 1842, this journal being kept by like Willard Richards and William Clayton and others, it says, reading at the office, general business in store and city. In the office in the evening with Elder John Taylor and recorder, interpreting dreams, etc. So presumably here Joseph is sharing a dream that he had and the interpretation thereof, or they're kind of discussing him with John Taylor, what the possible interpretation could be. So there's at least a mention of an implied dream by Joseph, since it just says interpreting dreams. Later that year, in December of 1842, in Joseph's journal, this kept by Willard Richards, It says, before starting a meeting, Joseph retold his, and then here it's blank, so it's presumed to mean dream. Before starting, Joseph retold his dream was by a beautiful stream of water, saw a noble, handsome fish, threw it out. Soon after, saw more, threw them out, and soon a great many, and threw out a great abundance, and sent for salt to salt them down, and salted them. So this dream of fish and throwing them out and salting them, preserving them. It's implied, of course, that it's a dream. It doesn't say directly in the journal the dream, but the way it talks about what it talks about presumes that it was a dream, and that was just an omission from Willard Richards to not say that word precisely. Here's one just a few weeks later, January of 1843, and then we'll dig into the bigger dreams that I want to share. So again, January 1843, in Joseph's journal, it says, I dreamed this morning that I was in the lobby of the Representative Hall at Springfield, when some of the members who did not like my being there began to mar, cut, and pound my shins with pieces of iron. These members are elected legislators. I bore it as long as I could, then jumped over the rail into the hall, caught a rod of iron, and went at them, cursing and swearing at them in the most unlawful manner, and drove them all out of the house. I went to the door and told them to send me a clerk, and I would make some laws that would do good. There was quite a collection around the State House trying to raise an army to take me, and there were many horses tied round the square. I thought they would not have the privilege of getting me so. I took a rod of iron and mowed my way through their ranks, looking after their best racehorse, thinking they might catch me when they could find me when I was awake. So, interesting, right? Maybe there's something there about kind of his political conflicts that he was having. His brother, I believe at this time, was in the legislature. And so they were having, a lot of conflicts. Of course, they had all the Nauvoo Charter and all the things going on that were causing them political problems and tensions with their surrounding neighbors. So, okay. Now, from what I could find in these dreams, and there were kind of a smattering more, we don't have interpretations. It's not like Joseph is saying, here's the dream and here's, the interpretation. It's just like, hey, I had this dream, or he doesn't even talk about the dream. He just says, I had a dream. So I will qualify everything I'm about to say in this musing with the following. Interpretations of dreams is not my spiritual gift. As a related tangent, I've lately been watching Andor, which is like a newer Star Wars TV show. Really excellent. I've really enjoyed it. And after watching some of the episodes, I watched this guy's YouTube video where he unpacks and analyzes the episodes. And my heavens, like I'm just, humdy-dum watching this show and having fun and some little insights and observations. But this guy in this YouTube channel is identifying all of these like key takeaways and insights and meaning. Like, here's why they framed it this way. Look at how they constructed this set and the hidden symbolism and how it relates to this past film or previous episode. And so I've been very impressed watching this video of this person who's able to kind of see a little bit more deeply into the intended meaning by the writers and the producers of this show. So clearly others are better at this than I in taking a show or a dream or whatever and kind of understanding the meaning. But I do think I have some interesting observations to share about each dream. So let's get into it. Let's start with the Steamboat dreams. So Steamboat 1, as I'll call it, the first Steamboat dream. This comes from the History of the Church. It was published in the History of the Church, and that in February 2nd of 1844. So this is just a few months before Joseph is assassinated. This History of the Church, I've shared before how stuff has crept into the official history of the church that I think is dubious or problematic. This, however, is supported by Wilford Woodruff's contemporary journal. The following day, February 3rd, here's an image of Wilford Woodruff's journal, which he furiously and regularly kept. And so it is a good way to kind of see what he's hearing, what he's observing, and as a way to, supplement what we read in the official history. Okay, the dream says, and I quote, I was standing on a peninsula in the midst of a vast body of water. Of course, this is Joseph. where there appeared to be a large harbor or pier built out for boats to come into. I was surrounded by my friends, and while looking at this harbor, I saw a steamboat approaching the harbor. There were bridges on the pier for persons to cross, and there came up a wind and drove the steamboat under one of the bridges and upset it. I ran up to the boat, expecting the persons would all drown, and wishing to do something to assist them. I put my hand against the side of the boat, and with one surge, I shoved it under the bridge and righted it up, and then told them to take care of themselves. But it was not long before I saw them starting out into the channel or main body of the water again. The storms were raging, and the waters rough. I said to my friends that if they did not understand the signs of the times and the spirit of prophecy, they would be apt to be lost. It was but a few moments after when we saw the waves break over the boat, and she soon foundered and went down with all on board. The storm and waters were still very rough, yet I told my friends around me that I believed I could stem those waves and storm, and swim in the waters better than the steamboat did. At any rate, I was determined to try it. But my friends laughed at me and told me I could not stand at all, but would be drowned. The waters looked clear and beautiful, though exceedingly rough, and I said I believed I could swim and I would try it anyhow. They said I would drown. I said I would have a frolic in the water, first if I did, and I dove off into the raging waves. I had swam but a short distance when a towering wave overwhelmed me for a time, but I soon found myself on the top of it. And soon I met the second wave in the same way, and for a while I struggled hard to live in the midst of the storm and waves, and soon found I gained upon every wave, and skimmed the torrent better and better, and I soon had power to swim with my head out of water, so the waves did not break over me at all, and I found that I had swam a great distance, and in looking about me, I saw my brother Samuel by my side. I asked him how he liked it. He said first rate, and I thought so too. I was soon enabled to swim with my head and shoulders out of the water, and I could swim as fast as any steamboat. In a little time it became calm, and I could rush through the water and only go into my loins, and soon I went into my knees, and finally could tread on the top of the water, and went almost with the speed of an arrow. I said to Samuel, "See how swift I can go." I thought it was a great sport and pleasure to travel with such speed, and I awoke. Okay, so again, this is documented in Wilford Woodruff's journal. Of course, he's writing down, presumably the following day or whatever, what he had heard. So, it's not literally a verbatim that some person's shorthand is recording it while Joseph's talking. So it's tough, right? It's not like Joseph literally said this word for word, but we can presume that Wilford Woodruff is trying to capture every little bit of substance and in the order and all the things of what Joseph said. So I think that this is a valid dream that Joseph did say it. I think there's some interesting observations to be had. Joseph, again, temporarily rescues the boat, but then he tells the passengers to take care of themselves. So he knew that the boat, presumably the church, the institution, could not be kept upright indefinitely by kind of constant prophetic, badgering. He had the quote, I wasn't prepared to share it, but it's coming to mind that, your minds have been darkened in times past because and maybe this is from Brigham, actually, you've come to rely upon, the prophet too much rather than thinking for yourselves. There's a quote either from, now that I'm saying, I'm pretty sure that was Brigham that said that. But this idea that the prophet can't hold everything together, right? He says, take care of yourselves, that especially after Joseph's death, the members would have to face the elements on their own. And so I see some symbolism here of Joseph doing what he can while he's there to upright the ship and fix things with the strength and the power that he was given, but that they went out into the open water after that, and he said, take care of yourselves, right? Specifically, he also said that you need to understand the signs of the times and the spirit of prophecy, otherwise you'd be lost. Interesting. Another observation I had, he talks about that his friends laughed at him, right? Presumably, these are all fellow members of the church, fellow leaders of the church. They're laughing at him. They're not having faith. I'm going to do a musing later on. I don't know when, but I think soon-ish, about a reframing of the great and spacious building, that I think oftentimes we assume that these are like evil people of the world picking. It's the anti-Mormons, right? The Gentiles. They're mocking at the saints. I think there's a case to be made that the people in the great and spacious building are members of the church who have so embraced the institutional rituals and culture that they react poorly to those who deviate from them in faith to work mighty miracles. Here's Joseph going and saying, I can do this. I can exercise faith and have power and swim in this water that the ship is struggling in. I can do these things. I can right the ship. I can save these people. And fellow members / leaders of the church are mocking him. They're laughing at him, his friends. And so I think there's an interesting way to look at the great and spacious building and have kind of a reframe of what it means for us today with that different lens. So future musing, I'll unpack that a little bit more. The ship sinking, I think, is akin to the church drifting off course, being condemned. Of course, it's clear back in 1832 where the Lord condemns the church collectively for treating lightly the things that they had received, and that they would remain under condemnation until they repent and remember the Book of Mormon, not only to say, but to do according to that which is written. I've talked about this in many of my books and many of my musings. That's in the Doctrine and Covenants. So I think that's the ship sinking, is that, Joseph tries to build the ship and get people on the ship and send them on the right path. He uprights the ship when it starts to falter under a bridge or obstacle that the church faced. And it's sinking. It's going out into open sea, and the people aren't prepared. They don't understand the signs of the times, etc. So I think this means the church as a collective body. We Latter-day Saints. Again, church means, from the Greek ecclesia, it means congregation. I'm not talking about, when I say the church, the institutional 501c3 / what was it called when I did that musing? It was the corporation soul, right? Where it's all within the corporation of the president of the Church, Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That's not the church. The church is all of us. The church is God's people collectively in this broader sense. And so that's what I think the ship sinking means. I found it interesting that he talked about his increasing personal power, right? I gained upon every wave. I soon had power to do these things. The question I ask myself here is, do I think and act that way? Here's Joseph with significant confidence and faith. Yes, in a dream, but he acted this way in his own life of proceeding with such faith that he could work mighty miracles, that he could rise to the occasion and do, these great things. And I don't think he was special in that regard. Like, sure, he's special, but that's not an exceptional thing. He was wanting all the saints to do it, and he lamented how quickly they fly to pieces like glass when you try to teach them anything that's contrary to their traditions. He was wanting to lift people up, just as Moses was wanting to lift the children of Israel up to see the face of God and have this experience, but they degraded, they wouldn't, they hardened their hearts, and so they lost the higher priesthood. Okay, so, and the last one I'll mention is Samuel is with Joseph here, going away from the ship. If the ship is the church, right, and it's struggling and it's faltering and it's going off into open sea, into the wilderness, whatever, right, wandering, if you will. Here's Samuel, not on the ship, but going with his brother Joseph and exercising this power and swimming in it. He calls it first rate. That sounds almost like an 80s, like rad, or I don't know. That must be like an 1840s kind of oh, this is cool. It's first rate. So Samuel says it's first rate in his dream. Now, you may not know this. Samuel was killed very shortly after Joseph and Hiram were, and there was a lot of speculation and mystery around his death. I'm going to do a musing just on that at a later date. But here I just want to flag that it's Samuel. It's not any of his other siblings. It's Samuel, not on the ship, but going with Joseph to exercise power and go off in a different direction. And then after Joseph dies, shortly after that, so too does Samuel. Okay, so that's Steamboat 1. I think it's legit. I think Joseph did share this dream, and I think it's impregnated with symbolism that we could unpack a little bit more, and I'm sure others can do far better than I at noticing things and observing some interesting insights. So if you have them, please share them in the comments. I would love to learn from you. Let's go to Steamboat 2. This one comes from W.W. Phelps. He is the source of this dream. He claims that Joseph told this dream to himself, W.W. Phelps, as well as Hiram, 2 evenings before their death. Now, Phelps did not publish this. He may have verbally shared it with people or whatever, we don't know, but it was not published until 1862. So this is almost 2 decades later. He publishes it in his almanac for the year. And among other things, in the almanac, you can find an assortment of random whatever. For example, a cough remedy. Put half a pint of good vinegar in a tumbler, in which place a new laid egg and cover the tumbler closely. In about 24 hours, the egg will be dissolved. Sweeten with sugar, and the fluid will be ready for use. Take a tablespoonful about 5 times a day. So that's your pioneer era frontier cold remedy. Or I liked this as a beekeeper. This was in the same almanac. Honey is composed of sugar, mucilage, and water, and being ready-made like manna in heaven, falls upon flowers and leaves and is gathered by bees. Aside from worldly philosophy, sugar or honey is one of the elements of a wise God, and better medicine than calomel. Good stuff. All right, so this is Phelps's almanac, where he's just publishing a bunch of like random whatever that people might find of interest. So in that almanac, Phelps publishes what he alleges to be, he calls it, in fact, Joseph Smith's last dream, not knowing or realizing apparently that we have record of a dream the night after that, which I'll share next. So he calls it Joseph Smith's last dream. But if Phelps is accurate, and this was something Joseph did say, and it was the 2 nights before Joseph dying, then this would actually be Joseph's second to last dream. So this one has a little bit of a dubious history just because 2 decades later it's being published. I don't believe there exists any other source to corroborate this other than 18 years later, Phelps writing this in his almanac. So with that qualifier, let's dig into the dream. Steamboat number 2. While I was at Jordan's in Iowa the other night, I dreamed that myself and my brother Hiram went on board of a large steamboat, lying in a small bay near the great ocean. Shortly after we went on board, there was an alarm of fire, and I discovered that the boat had been anchored some distance from the shore, out in the bay, and that an escape from the fire in the confusion appeared hazardous. But as delay was folly, I and Hiram jumped overboard and tried our faith at walking upon the water. At first we sank in the water nearly to our knees, but as we proceeded we increased in faith, and were soon able to walk upon the water. On looking towards the burning boat in the east, we saw that it was drifting towards the wharf and the town, with a great flame and clouds of smoke, and, as if by whirlwind, the town was taking fire too, so that the scene of destruction and horror of the frightened inhabitants was terrible. We proceeded on the bosom of the mighty deep, and were soon out of sight of land. The ocean was still, the rays of sun were bright, and we forgot all the troubles of our Mother Earth. Just at that moment I heard the sound of a human voice, and, turning round, saw my brother Samuel approaching towards us from the east. We stopped, and he came up. After a moment's conversation, he informed me that he had been lonesome back, and had made up his mind to go with me across the mighty deep. We all started again, and in short time were blessed with the first sight of a city, whose gold and silver steeples and towers were more beautiful than any I had ever seen or heard of on earth. It stood, as it were, upon the western shore of the mighty deep we were walking on, and its order and glory seemed far beyond the wisdom of man. While we were gazing upon the perfection of the city, a small boat launched off from the port, and almost as quick as thought came to us. In an instant they took us on board and saluted us with a welcome, and with music such as is not on earth. The next scene, on landing, was more than I can describe. The greeting of old friends, the music from 1,000 towers, and the light of God himself at the return of 3 of his sons, soothed my soul into a quiet and a joy that I felt as if I was truly in heaven. I gazed upon the splendor, I greeted my friends, I awoke, and lo, it was a dream. While I meditated upon such a marvelous scene, I fell asleep again, and behold, I stood near the shore of the burning boat, and there was a great consternation among the officers, crew, and passengers of the flaming craft. as there seemed to be much ammunition or powder on board. The alarm was given that the fire was near the magazine, and in a moment suddenly it blew up with a great noise and sank in deep water with all on board. I then turned to the country east among the bushy openings and saw William and Wilson Law endeavoring to escape from the wild beasts of the forest, but 2 lions rushed out of a thicket and devoured them. I awoke again. Okay. To which all of this, as Phelps writes it in his almanac, he says right after the dream concludes, I relate from recollection as nearly as I can. So, of course, he has the benefit of 18 years later. Maybe there was a dream that Joseph shared. Maybe Phelps is embellishing onto it because, of course, he knows that Samuel died just days later. And so he can kind of narratively weave that in and, the 3 of them, Hiram, Joseph, and Samuel, all go off into this great city to heaven to be reunited with old friends, that God is pleased with the return of 3 of his sons. Like, that could be a plausible thing that Phelps is just kind of taking poetic license, or not even intentionally, but just he's kind of recreating in his later desires what he purports to have remembered from 2 decades before. I don't know. It could also be that this was an accurate retelling, because Steamboat 1, which does have a contemporary source from Wilford Woodruff, does involve Samuel. Right now, of course, it's possible that Steamboat 2 is kind of a derivation of Steamboat 1, that Phelps was aware of this dream somehow in Wilford Woodruff's journal, that he was present at the meeting where it was shared, or he was in the company with Woodruff when he heard it. I don't know. And therefore, right, or it's possible that Joseph was having this recurring theme come up in a dream, and it was all legit. Hard to say. It's just the 2 decades later just introduces some questions. But let's unpack a few observations. The first is that the fire originates inside the anchored steamboat that's out in the water, and then it spreads to the surrounding area, including the town. So to me, this is an image of internal combustion, especially when it explodes, when the fire reaches the magazine of gunpowder and so forth. But it's an issue of internal problems and explosion. So I'm thinking here of, apostasy and corruption. It's an internal problem rather than an external attack, right? The fire started on the ship and then spread outwards, which reminded me of section 112 from the Doctrine and Covenants. Here it is. Behold, vengeance cometh speedily upon the inhabitants of the earth, a day of wrath, a day of burning, a day of desolation, of weeping, of mourning, of lamentation. And as a whirlwind it shall come upon all the face of the earth, saith the Lord. And upon my house shall it begin, and from my house shall it go forth, saith the Lord. First among those among you, saith the Lord, who have professed to know my name and have not known me, and have blasphemed against me in the midst of my house, saith the Lord. Very interesting, right? Because in verse 24, it talks about a day of burning. And so the imagery in this dream is of the ship and then the broader area burning. Verse 24 also says it will come on as a whirlwind. And in the dream, it says that, with a great flame and clouds of smoke, and as if by whirlwind the town was taking fire. Now, of course, again, Phelps knows this revelation in section, what we now have as section 112, and it's possible that he's drawing things in, or it's possible that this is just kind of multiple angles and witnesses of something that is being revealed from God to Joseph in this dream. So yeah, day of burning and coming on like a whirlwind, and then it starts upon my house, and from my house shall it go forth. So the imagery in this dream of the ship burning and exploding and causing fire to spread to surrounding areas is consistent with one of the existing revelations from God on the topic. Kind of an interesting angle, I think. Another observation here is that the walking on water seems to improve from with distance from the ship. So the further out they go, the better they do. This could be an issue of separation from the burning ship, and that increases your spiritual abilities by not clinging to the burning ship and its problems and challenges. Or it could just be something more benign, where Joseph and Hiram and Samuel are just improving with time. Maybe it's not a distance issue. It's just like, oh yeah, we were in our knees to start, but then we were exercising more faith. And as time went on, we improved. And it doesn't have to do with the distance away. It just has to do with them really applying themselves. So Steamboat 1, I think fully legit from Joseph. Steamboat 2, maybe there's some creative recollections being infused into what was actually a dream. But because of its kind of consistency with scripture and with Steamboat 1, seems plausible, but I think we have to be a little bit cautious about just reading Phelps's 2 decades later recollection as some near verbatim thing from Joseph. So it's interesting, it's informative, it's fun to kind of interpret what the possible symbolism may be, and it kind of overlaps though with scripture, with Steamboat 1, and also then with the final dream. So this is the dream that Joseph is purported to have had on the final evening of his mortal life. The source of this dream is Cyrus Wheelock. Now, Wheelock, Cyrus, this guy, tried to convince the governor of Illinois to release Joseph from Carthage jail. He is the one who John Taylor says furnished Joseph Smith with a pistol, which Joseph had when the mob attacked the jail at Carthage. So John Taylor names this guy Cyrus, he came in with kind of a trench coat kind of thing to visit the people who were there, because they would allow visitors to come back and forth. And he had a pistol in his pocket. So he came in and he's allegedly like, hey, does anyone want this? Joseph's like, yeah, I want it. So that pistol comes from Cyrus. He's also, by the way, the author of Ye Elders of Israel. So this is this guy, Cyrus Wheelock. And in the history of the church, these editors and scribes, they were taking from journals, Joseph's journals, other people's journals, and newspapers, and all this stuff, and trying to synthesize a kind of fuller, linear history of the church, right? That was their task and their charge. And so here is an image from the history of the church where this final dream appears. And if you rotate the image, you can see written over it the word Wheelock. And this is on multiple pages. The scribes indicating that Cyrus Wheelock is the source of this dream. He is the person who says, I heard Joseph say this, and then he, writes it down and shares it, and it makes its way into the history of the church. So again, we're not getting this straight from Joseph or straight from one of Joseph's scribes or in a public meeting where 4 people are witnesses and all writing it down, therefore corroborating one another, right? So there are there's challenges with most everything, not most everything, but with significant amounts of what we claim Joseph said and taught, because we rely on, just William Clayton for some of the craziest things, and we rely on a single scribe or a single person here and there. I've talked ad nauseum about that in past musings. But Cyrus Wheelock is the guy, and he is the source for this final dream that finds its way into the history of the church. Let's dig into the dream. Joseph says, I was back in Kirtland, Ohio, and thought I would take a walk out by myself and view my old farm, which I found grown up with weeds and brambles, and altogether bearing evidence of neglect and want of culture. I went into the barn, which I found without floor or doors, with the weatherboarding off, and was altogether in keeping with the farm. While I viewed the desolation around me, and was contemplating how it might be recovered from the curse upon it, there came rushing into the barn a company of furious men who commenced to pick a quarrel with me. The leader of the party ordered me to leave the barn and the farm, stating it was none of mine, and that I must give up all hope of ever possessing it. I told him the farm was given me by the church, and although I had not had any use of it for some time back, still I had not sold it, and according to righteous principles it belonged to me or the church. He then grew furious, and began to rail upon me and threaten me, and said it never did belong to me nor the church. I then told him that I did not think it worth contending about, that I had no desire to live upon it in its present state, and if he thought he had a better right, I would not quarrel with him about it, but leave. But my assurance that I would not trouble him at present did not seem to satisfy him, as he seemed determined to quarrel with me, and threaten me with destruction of my body. While he was thus engaged, pouring out his bitter words upon me, a rabble rushed in, and nearly filled the barn, drew out their knives, and began to quarrel among themselves for the premises. and for a moment forgot me, at which time I took the opportunity to walk out of the barn about up to my ankles in mud. When I was a little distance from the barn, I heard them screeching and screaming in a very distressed manner, as it appeared they had engaged in a general fight with their knives. While they were thus engaged, the dream or vision ended. Okay, interesting stuff, right? A few insights to glean, perhaps. He talks about the curse on the barn, on the structure. He says, contemplating how it might be recovered from the curse upon it. Again, making me think of the 1832 condemnation on the church. This is a physical decay of the first gathering place in Kirtland. I think the farm might symbolize, the early covenants being made, the law of consecration, the law of the Lord, caring for the poor, even learning about secret combinations and being warned of them, and things like, the word of wisdom, but in the Book of Mormon. And so this neglect of this structure seems to mirror the Latter-day Saints treating the revelations lightly, which is what it says in section 84 when the Lord condemns the church. The weeds and brambles, right? He says, I went to my old farm, which I found grown up with weeds and brambles. To me, that could represent apostasy and idolatry, that the teachings that Joseph had been trying to restore and to teach were being encumbered by all kinds of counter ideas, and people were bringing their baggage from past beliefs and churches and traditions of the fathers and philosophies of men and so forth. And so the weeds and the brambles are coming into the church. The tares are among the wheat, right? The idea of there being no floor, no doors, no weatherboards, to me symbolizes the structural issues with the church, right? There's no gatekeepers. It's exposed to the elements. It's a shell of its former self. It's still standing, but it's not able to provide protection and comfort like it once did. And so again, I feel like this is a depiction of the condemned church, that, people who, like Isaiah says, and it says this in the Doctrine and Covenants too, people who draw near to the Lord with their lips, but their hearts are far from him. So there's kind of the superficial and the structure is there, but the substance is not. A lot of weeds and brambles, and there's decay, but people are fighting over it. They claim that it's theirs. They are fighting over table scraps, basically. So these intruders who are trying to wrest control of the barn or the church, certainly Joseph was facing this during his life. There were people, who spun off separate churches and claiming that Joseph was a fallen prophet. And in the prior dream, right, it talked about William Law, who was in the church leadership with Joseph and claimed that Joseph was a fallen prophet and went off and started his own church, which went nowhere. And so there was plenty of this, of these intruders wresting control of Joseph's, of his authority and his position while he was alive, of course, but then certainly with the succession crisis after, caused in large part because Joseph was not necessarily clear about exactly what succession would look like, and at times said a few different things. There was certainly contention and infighting after Joseph's death. So that was kind of an interesting thing, that on the final night of his life, he's observing this contention over this dilapidated barn full of weeds and brambles. I also think it's interesting, Joseph refuses to fight. He walks away in ankle-deep mud as the intruders turn on one another. So throughout scriptures, right, when people turn wicked and the Lord will take the prophet out of their midst, right? Hey, I tried, you were given a chance, you had this opportunity, you fell from grace, you apostatized, you embraced all kinds of idolatry, so I'm going to take the prophet away. So perhaps, this is Joseph and Hiram and Samuel being taken away because of, the sins of this generation. Perhaps that's what the mud represents, that Joseph is kind of having to navigate the mucky, situation that the saints find themselves in because of their choices. The knife fight ensues. I mean, that to me just speaks to like the post-Joseph leadership contests and people saying, I'm the leader, and all that. But again, it could also refer to the scheming that was happening while Joseph was yet alive. Let's wrap with a few concluding observations and questions. I think there's a few motifs that we can see through all of these dreams. the idea of water in turmoil, right? Going back to the steamboat dreams, both of the steamboat dreams, but then in the last dream, Joseph is up to his ankles in mud. In the Kirtland farm dream, this reminded me of section 61 of the Doctrine and Covenants, where the Lord says, "There are many dangers upon the waters, for I, the Lord, have decreed in mine anger many destructions upon the waters." So I just found it interesting that the water theme was a part of all of these, and it's part in the kind of destruction. And Joseph was having to gain power over the water and rise above it, where others were struggling in it. I'm also intrigued by, there's the institutional structure, the ship, the barn, versus the free swimmer and walker, right? So in the steamboat dreams, Joseph and his brothers are swimming independent of the burning ship or struggling ship. And then in the barn dream, Joseph is walking away from the structure, just abandoning almost, the structure. To me, I mean, maybe there's an element here that salvation is secured by individual faith. You can't rely on the crutch of the institution, clinging to a failing vessel, right? Loyalty to the organization doesn't necessarily ensure safety, because in his dreams, the people went down with the ship. They sunk with the ship. They died on the exploded ship. They presumably died in a knife fight in the barn. So that's kind of an interesting thing to make us try and analyze, okay, what does the structure mean? Does the structure have its challenges? How can we follow Joseph's example of building our own relationship with the Lord and exercising faith and developing this power directly from God? It's not to say the structure is wrong or there's a problem, but if people are allowing it to decay, or if they're not exercising sufficient, faith to have the ship be upright and free of being burned and all the rest, like, raises some interesting questions about individual obligations versus institutional obligations. And, in our church culture, it very much is, I believe the church is true, and therefore everything is all encompassing within the church. And especially those who deviate from that are seen to be those wandering off the straight and narrow. Whereas, as I'll explore perhaps in this future musing, it could be that a lot of times we who cling to the institution might become like the people in the great and spacious building, mocking those who, yes, are veering off of the institutional approved path, and therefore it looks like apostasy, and you're mocking the people who are, I don't know, right? I'm gonna explore that a little bit later. I still have some thoughts swirling around on that as I've been reading lately, but it hints that scoffers might sit within our faith community, not necessarily outside of it, right? Again, Joseph talked about his mocking friends, right, who were laughing at his idea of swimming and being able to do that. So kind of just interesting ideas. I think the absence of Hiram and Samuel in the Kirtland scene, right? He's there by himself. Maybe that underscores Joseph's final solitude. He's very close with Hiram, close with Samuel as well, but at the end of the day, like, this was his charge and his responsibility, and so he's alone in this Kirtland dream. Final thought, perhaps, or observation, is the neglected stewardship. So the overgrown farm, the barn doesn't have a floor. Leaders or purported leaders are quarreling over the property, and Joseph just walks away. He doesn't even contest ownership. He's withdrawing and allowing them to just fight amongst themselves, and he's saying, I'm going to go in a different direction. It's just interesting how rich these dreams are with symbolism. Now, it could be that I'm completely off base. Again, this is not my spiritual gift to interpret dreams and receive directly from God what, Joseph was meaning here. There's also the question of some of this is filtering through Phelps 2 decades later, or Cyrus Wheelock, presumably a few days or weeks later, where he's saying, here's what Joseph told us about his dream. So we're perhaps not getting distilled from Joseph as if he was over the pulpit in general conference being recorded to have a perfect transcription of what he said. So there's a little bit of that in here as well. But I just feel like there's almost this, like this, those who have eyes to see and ears to hear might find meaning in here, which for the average member of the church in our culture would present uncomfortable questions, right? Anytime that I have brought up in past musings instances where I think there have been incorrect things taught or done within the church, I'll get lambasted by a lot of people because it's very contradictory to the order of things. They say, you're trying to study the ark, or you're speaking evil of the Lord's anointed, and all the rest, even though I've done musings in the past, for example, on the fact that we are all the Lord's anointed, and that statement doesn't mean that you can't say anything bad about anything church leaders, have made a decision on or critique it in any way. You just must presume that everything is from God and get in lockstep behind them. That's not my sentiment. That's not my understanding. I don't think that's God's intent. But to suggest, as these dreams seem to imply, that the ship was and may still be burning or drifting and struggling under a bridge and going out into open sea, or that the barn is having weeds and brambles come in and is somewhat dilapidated, to suggest that those things have an implication about the modern church is very uncomfortable for members of the church, including myself, right? This is not how I was raised to think. This is not how I was raised to process information. In our culture, you definitely have a resistance towards this type of approach. But still, I wonder, based on these dreams, based on what God's revelations have said, right? That we're condemned as a church, that it will, the plagues and destruction and the burnings and everything will start in the church and then spread elsewhere. The fact that even the elect can be deceived, the fact that there are tares amongst the wheat. God again and again and again has been saying, you are not immune in the latter days from these trends. You are not exempt from the apostasy and the idolatry that has befallen past godly societies. This is something I discuss in my forthcoming book, The Slow Stain, at length. But the point is that I think we need to make sure that if the ship, to whatever extent, might be burning or faltering, or the barn is having problems, like, we have to focus on our individual obligations. We have to focus on our discipleship. We have to not get caught up in the traditions of men and the philosophies of men and the idolatry that might have seeped into our fellow church members' minds and worldviews. We have to perhaps follow Joseph's example and figure out, how do we exercise that faith to be able to even walk on water? How do we not be in the infighting and the squabbling and the knife fights, but just say, let's forge a different path and a direct relationship with God? I'm not saying, by the way, in any of this, one ought to leave the church, or that the church is corrupt and fallen, or that the church is not true, and all these things. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that an institution governed and run and composed of fallible, mortal people inevitably will have problems. Does that mean those problems can't be overcome? No. Does that mean that we can't have course corrections? Clearly not. But I think we have to be careful of not relying on the church as a crutch and being a slothful servant waiting to be commanded in all things, that, I'll just do exactly what the church does, nothing more, nothing less, because surely that's what God wants. When I think he wants far more. I talk about that in the book. I'll share later when the book comes out in a bit more detail what I'm thinking. So some final questions. Are we riding a steamboat that already has some smoke below deck? And if so, what are we doing about that? Do we try and help put the fire out before it spreads? Do we try and help right the ship? Do we abandon ship? I'm not suggesting that. I think there's, ample time. I don't think these dreams are a fatalistic determination about exactly what's happening in, 2025 right now. I do think that we can all contribute our voices and our faith and call out for repentance and purging ourselves of the idolatry and the apostasy, and encouraging others to have more faith in God and commitment to our covenants. Like, I think there's ample time to still try and address the fire. Granted, the Lord does seem rather deterministic when he said in the last days, this is what will happen. It will start in my house and it will go forth from everywhere else. So perhaps there is kind of a fatalistic aspect of this where maybe it's like the Titanic. We're going to hit the iceberg. So maybe you want to get in the little, life rafts and get to safety. I don't know. Some of these are just not well-formed thoughts that I'm still questioning and processing and thinking about. So again, I welcome your thoughts in the comments. I also wonder, have I been guilty in the past of mocking the swimmers who choose not to stay on board? Joseph was like, hey, I'm jumping off the ship, right? Him and Hiram, and we're going to go exercise faith and go swim and walk on the water. It's there very much is, I know certainly there are people who leave the church or who are kicked out of the church who are very anti and very oppositional, and they turn atheistic and they criticize Joseph and all of that. I'm not talking about those people, but there are a number of people, I know many of them, who are either pushed out or choose to leave the church, but who are deeply faithful to the restored gospel of Christ and deeply believing in Joseph and the Book of Mormon and Joseph's revelations and on and on and on. But for whatever reason, their path has been to go swimming, quote unquote, if you will, and to not be part of the ship. So how do we on the ship treat those people? How do we consider them? Do we mock them? Do we think that they are inherently wrong for not being aboard the ship? That's kind of an interesting question for me to think about for myself. What weeds, I wonder, on Joseph's farm, his original revelations and the restored gospel, what weeds on the farm need clearing before Zion can be reclaimed? What are the weeds and brambles that might exist today? Again, that's an uncomfortable question. When you imply that in our church culture and community, there are weeds, there are tares, right? Because then everyone's like, well, surely it can't be any single leader of the church. They're all great people that have, nothing but our best interests at heart. And, maybe it's just random members here and there, or that guy with a podcast, or that guy with a whatever, Facebook group or whatever. It's very easy to just be like, oh, we're fine. We're immune from this. We're so sophisticated and we're so much better than those ignorant, idolatrous rubes of past generations, right? But still, I wonder, what are the weeds and brambles that have come into the farm, to the barn? And I think they exist. I've written about and talked about them before, but I think we ought to more frequently reflect on what are the false ideas and teachings that have crept into the church in the broad sense, into the church community. Again, I'll talk about that in Slow Stain, my upcoming book, in more detail. Okay, I'll wrap there. I find these very interesting. I think there's certainly merit to their veracity in some significant measure. Certainly Steamboat 1, the one that was sinking. Phelps's dream, maybe not, maybe parts, I don't know, but it's still interesting nonetheless. And then the final dream, getting it from Cyrus Wheelock, and these are very, very interesting. So I'm curious, again, in the comments, what are your thoughts? What are the implications or the interpretations of these dreams? What does it mean? Maybe it means nothing. Maybe it means something entirely different. Maybe it was a totally benign dream. But the fact that you see this kind of recurring theme in Joseph's very last days, makes me at least wonder, like, okay, maybe there's like some acute lessons to be had here that we ought to pay attention to, that God was communicating. Kind of interesting stuff. Again, share in the comments. You have other insights, other observations. I welcome them, and I'll see you guys next Sunday.